And welcome back to Coast. George Norrie with you. Chris Aubeck with us. Was born in London, has lived in Spain since 1991, where he teaches English. He started his journey exploring UFO history in his early teens and has collaborated with some of the best minds in the field. He's the founder of the historical research group called Magonia Exchange, an international project with members in 10 countries. He's an author, co-author of a number of books, including Wonders in the Sky with Jacques Vallée, Return to Magonia, Op Parts, Alien Artifacts and Saucers, and lectures widely and regularly contributes to programs in both English and Spanish. And here he is back on Coast to Coast. Hello, Chris.
Hi there. How's it going? Thanks
Good.
for having me again.
Looking forward to this. And tell me a little bit about your English teaching. Are the folks in Spain really wanting to learn English?
Oh, yeah. I mean, English is such an important language these days. And, when I first arrived here in 1991, it was French. Everybody wanted to learn French. And, most people studied French at school. But what happened over the next few years was that English started to spread around the world so quickly through TV and, of course, the Internet. That was a massive revolution. And these days, if you don't know English, you can't get a job. So I've been teaching people all over the country, including politicians. And right now, the mayor of Madrid, a woman called Isabel Ayuso, used to be my student. She used to make coffee and toast for me in the mornings in her house. And that was great. And I ended up giving classes to film directors. These days, if you don't know English, you just don't really get very far in the world.
That is so true. Chris, how did you get interested in UFOs?
Well, when I was about 13, 14 years old, I found an old paperback book on a market stall, and it was by Eric von Daniken. Return to the Stars, it was called. And I thought, wow, this is interesting. And at the time, I was collecting Marvel comics. But it was so similar in a sense, the idea of these gods coming from other planets to teach mankind. And I thought, wow, that reminds me of Thor and the Asgardians. And I just got into it that way, I suppose. And then I realized that there was a lot more to it than met the eye. The idea of ancient civilizations coming into contact with alien teachers, it just fascinated me as a child. And then, of course, I began watching Battlestar Galactica and a lot of these 1970s TV series which explored the same themes. And I thought, I want to get deeper into this. And then when I was 18, I went to the States. I was in California and in Minnesota visiting different UFO writers. And, since then it's been a big part of my life.
The pictures in your book are fantastic, by the way, Chris.
Okay, thank you very much. Well, this book, I decided to make something that would entertain as well as to teach. And, these days, young people don't read as much as they used to.
No, they don't.
They love manga, they love pictures, they love internet. I thought I'm gonna design a book which is as informative as it is entertaining in that sense. And practically every page of the book has pictures that interact in some way with the text. And, people have written to me saying, "Wow, why didn't you put a picture on page 162 or something? I was disappointed to discover a page without a picture on it." I'm very sorry about that. But this is the great thing about publishing through Amazon and self-publishing. It gives you that kind of freedom. You can play with the text a lot more, and you can become really creative.
Let's start in 1947, a very important year. We had Roswell in July, but in June of 47, Kenneth Arnold witnessed what he saw were a number of shaped UFOs, flying saucers. You basically start your book with him.
That's right, because when you look at UFO history, you've got to start right at the beginning. And really, Kenneth Arnold is a kind of cultural hero in a sense. He's an iconic figure in the history of ufology. If it hadn't been for his sighting, we probably wouldn't be here talking about UFOs today. So he saw these 9 weird objects from his private airplane as he was flying over Washington State. And they surprised him so much because they reminded him of terrestrial technologies, maybe something more advanced than we'd been using on Earth. And he felt that it was his responsibility to report it, which is exactly what he did. When he landed, he went to the offices of the East Oregonian newspaper and said what he'd seen. Of course, this was a time of there was a lot of paranoia in that period because this was just after World War II, and it was the start of the Cold War. So, yeah, he felt that it was his responsibility and duty to tell people what he'd seen.
What do you think he saw, Chris?
It's such a difficult question. There are so many theories. I mean, I'm 100% convinced he saw something. This was a very honest man, a very sincere man. He was definitely confused by what he saw. The statements he went on to make were a little bit contradictory, but we're talking about a guy who couldn't take a photograph of what he saw. He didn't make a drawing immediately. I don't know. I just hope whatever they are, whether they were controlled by intelligent beings or some other kind of phenomena, I mean, I don't think they're here to harm us. I just hope they're not here to eat us alive. Exactly,
like that Twilight Zone episode.
Exactly, yeah.
In 1947, when Arnold made his sighting, when it was released of what he did, was he welcomed in open arms or was he ridiculed? What happened to his life?
Yeah, it was a massive impact on his life because at the beginning, he was ridiculed and believed in equal measure, I would say. People were fascinated by his story. They wanted to know more. People all over the country started sending him letters, contacting him through every means possible. But this had a big impact on his family life, too. I mean, his kids were a little bit singled out at school, and they're the children of the guy who saw Martians. I mean, there's this famous moment just after his sighting when Kenneth Arnold was sitting in a cafeteria, and a woman came in and pointed at him and said, "There's the guy who saw the Martians," and she ran out shrieking.
Oh, geez.
So, I mean, there was quite a lot of paranoia at the time, and no one was used to the idea of UFOs landing or aliens being seen in the sky. So, and then a lot of other people thought it might be enemy technology, perhaps sent by the Russians, the Japanese, even the Nazis, because, of course, we're talking about a time just after World War II. So no one really knew what to make of it all.
You devote several chapters to some ancient historical UFO events. I've always wondered, Chris, if the Bible was making reference to UFO visitations when they talked about fallen angels. What do you think?
Yeah, there's a theory about that. Interestingly, this theory, as I showed in my previous book, Alien Artifacts, which I published last November, people have been talking about that for 150, 200 years. This idea that perhaps we should reinterpret the Bible as a kind of guidebook to alien civilizations and beings throughout the universe. There's been a lot of talk about whether demons and angels were extraterrestrials, even Adam and Eve, since the 18th century. So, I mean, if you do want to believe that the Bible references UFOs and aliens, you're in good company in that sense, because a lot of intellectuals and philosophers have speculated in that way over the centuries. So, yeah, I'd refer anyone to my previous book, Alien Artifacts, to get the details on that.
You wrote a book called Wonders in the Sky with a dear friend of ours, Dr. Jacques Vallée, and tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, so I started this research project called Magonia Exchange in April 2003. And he was almost the first member we ever had because he was attracted to the idea of historical UFOs as much as I was. Oddly enough, the first email that I ever sent in my life was in 1997, and that was to my friend Jacques Vallée. And he replied saying he was very happy to help me with my own projects on historical UFOs. So in the year 2005, I believe it was, I went to Portugal and met up with him. There was a conference about the Fatima vision at the time, and it was great. I had dinner with him and his wife then, Janine, who has since died, and he said, let's do something together. And then we began putting this book together, Wonders in the Sky, which when we published it, we knew it was going to be a first draft because it's very difficult to find 500 good UFO sightings from history that you can really sort of defend as probable anomalies. But anyway, we put it together saying we might have to revise it in the future. And then we did, of course, a few years later, and we made a hardback version of it. I'd like to make a new version of that book in the next year or so. I'm working on it now, in fact. But it's great because it's the first time that you can see the UFO landscape of our ancestors. You can see how this phenomenon was so common in the ancient past, and how basically what we see today can be found in ancient chronicles. Very few UFO books have gone into such detail as we did in Wonders in the Sky. We need to make a corrected version, an expanded version. Yeah, that's something that we're going to work on together, I think.
You discussed the possibility that the military would discuss flying saucers years before the Kenneth Arnold 1947 sightings. Well, there's
an interesting thing here because on the one hand, there were UFO sightings at the beginning of the 20th century and even towards the end of the 19th century that attracted military interest. And that's fascinating because we don't associate military interest with something from such a long time ago. But, another discovery that I made was that the expression flying saucer didn't originate in 1947 at all. It's something from the 1880s, and it was invented for a totally different reason related to sport. But the interesting thing is around 1943, 1944, the U.S. Army was using flying saucers, the expression flying saucers, to describe clay discs, which they used to train their gunners for them to fight Nazi planes over Germany. And so the actual expression itself, flying saucer, was very much related to the military world in the 1940s, before 1947, and that's one of the main discoveries I've published in this book, Saucers.
In your book, Saucers, what was the main thing you wanted people to grasp and get?
Well, what I want them to understand is that UFOs have a fascinating history, and this kind of study is really long overdue. We should know something about where this comes from. If we have any interest at all in the world of UFOs, we should know how this started, when this started, and who did it. I mean, what I want is for readers to understand the roots of this subject, especially now that UFOs have become such a significant part of our culture and are drawing so much attention from the government these days. Mm-hmm. People have to realize the impact that UFO phenomena has had on general culture and appreciate its historical significance. And apart from that, I want them to realize that the image of the disc-shaped UFO came from probably a mistake in a newspaper published in the 1940s. And I think it's important for us to know this kind of thing, to defend ourselves from disinformation, because we're bombarded by so much disinformation and confusing information about these subjects. It's so hard to get to the sort of to do real history, to find a good book about how all of this started. And that was my main mission here. I think we owe it to ourselves if we're interested at all in this field to get down to the roots of how it all began.
Chris, didn't Kenneth Arnold describe them originally as the animal bats, as bat-shaped?
Yes, he did. The first adjective he ever used to describe the shape of his objects was somewhat bat-shaped. He didn't call them saucers. He didn't say that they were discoid. He just said that they were somewhat bat-shaped. And the reason for that is that in the 1940s, a very popular aircraft design that was destined, well, they hoped would revolutionize aviation forever, was the flying wing, which was a little bit like a boomerang-shaped aircraft that was designed by Northrop for use in battle in World War II. Unfortunately, they didn't finish it on time, but it was such a popular, like a celebrity airplane that appeared in all of the newspapers. These days, newspapers talk about the Kardashians. At that time, it was all about airplanes and technology, you know? And so this kind of craft is called the bat, and that's why he used this word.
When Kenneth Arnold finally passed, do you know if he was satisfied with what was going on in the field of ufology, or was he still frustrated? He
was pretty frustrated most of his life. I spoke to his daughter, Kim Arnold, about this, and I read every interview he ever gave. And, yeah, I mean, at the beginning, he was pretty frustrated because no one seemed to listen to him. Everyone said that they were seeing saucer-shaped objects, and that's not what he had seen at all. So he felt a little bit guilty for having invented that or having accidentally created the myth of the disc-shaped object. And then by the time he died, well, you know, you do mellow out as you get older, and he accepted that maybe the field was stranger than even he had ever imagined. But I think he was quite frustrated that people had never listened to him properly, that they had preconceived notions about what he had experienced. And it wasn't his fault. It was a journalistic mistake that led to a lot of the myths surrounding him and his experience. So, yeah, I think that he would have liked to have read this book himself, because it would have set the record straight.
He would have been proud of this book.
I think so, because one of the things I did that hadn't been done before was to collect every single statement he made about the shape of his objects, because apart from the speed and everything else, it's the shape that's determined how we perceive UFOs in the modern world. So I collected every one of his statements he ever gave on what these objects look like. I've put them in the book in a fun way, but in a way that the reader can actually read themselves and reach their own conclusions. And so you can see there exactly what he said.
You did a great job with that, Chris. We're going to take a short break, Chris. We'll come back and chat more on Coast to Coast AM. And welcome back to Coast. George Norrie with Chris Aubeck. We'll take calls with Chris next hour here on Coast to Coast. Chris, you talk a little bit about the editor of the Amazing Stories magazine, Ray Palmer. He was a friend of, was he not, of John Keel?
Yeah, that's right. I mean, John Keel actually had the opinion that Ray Palmer had invented was the man who invented flying saucers. I mean, we know that's not really true, but Ray Palmer did have a significant influence on the popularization of flying saucers in the 1940s and 50s. And his interest in Kenneth Arnold's sighting wasn't by chance, because Palmer had been discussing extraterrestrial visits to Earth for years. When he'd heard about Arnold's experience, he saw it as a potential evidence for his theories. So while it's not true that Palmer personally invented flying saucers, we could say that he reinvented Kenneth Arnold in a sense, because he reshaped Arnold's perceptions of his own sighting. So, I mean, in a sense, yeah, John Keel was right. Palmer had a massive influence on the field. But no, UFOs had existed before then.
What do you think, Chris, of the alien abduction phenomenon?
Well, that's a fascinating question too. I did a documentary for the History Channel several years ago where I mentioned how alien abduction is so similar to demonology and witchcraft reports from the 15th century. There was a book called the Malleus Maleficarum. I believe it was published in 1484, a very long time ago now, where they describe how demons interacted with people, with witches, and it describes very, very similar things going on. We're talking about sort of sexual things and hybrid children, all that kind of thing. And then there's a mystic called Jane Laird, who was born in the 17th century in London, and her experiences were very similar too. She sometimes described UFOs flying through the clouds, objects coming down from the sky, going back up into the sky. But she also described moments in which she was looking through her bedroom window, and suddenly she felt transported to a star in the sky, where she'd find herself in a large room surrounded by other people, weird beings. She'd also have to interact with strange sort of hybrid-like children. It seems that it's a very, very old subject, and I'm hoping to publish books about this in the future, because I think there's a lot more to it than even UFO abduction researchers know about. We really need a historical perspective on this, because that also helps the argument for abductions, because then the further we go back, the less contamination there can be from the X-Files or from science fiction.
Tell us about your Alien Artifact series.
Yeah, well, this is a book, the first volume I published last November, and it takes us all the way back to ancient Greece, where they first believed in the possibility that the universe was full of advanced civilizations like our own. And then it takes the reader through to medieval times, when even the Vatican had to discuss the possibility that the universe was replete with alien life, and they reached the conclusion that it probably was. That was the interesting thing. So it means that people have been discussing aliens and alien life in the cosmos for at least 800-900 years in Europe. And then I take the reader on a journey through the first ever UFO sightings from the 19th century, starting in 1857 with the publication of a little book called The Magic Monitor, where they describe a weird ship that appears over a village called Jay in Ohio. The crew members seem to be giant figures, which you could see from the ground. And the author of this book says they seem to be interplanetary travelers here on a mission of exploration, or maybe here to commerce with us in some way. And so the UFO story really begins in this little village called Jay, Ohio, in 1857. And this book, the first volume, Alien Artifacts, goes on about all these interesting events throughout the 19th century. And then another thing, of course, I explore the origins of the ancient aliens theory, which is also a lot older than what people imagine. It really started in 1823, which means that year is the 200th anniversary of the ancient astronaut hypothesis. I don't know if we should go out and celebrate, but it's an interesting fact.
Chris, what do you think of the July 1947 Roswell, New Mexico case? What do you think of that?
Well, on the one hand, I think it's a very interesting story. It didn't really become popular until around 1978. It's just something that happened and then was forgotten about, and lots of other UFO crash stories came to light. Then it seems that from 1978 onwards, it became very popular. Lots of witnesses came forward, so if you trust a witness testimony, it's one of the best documented cases in that sense. But I look at it again from a historical perspective. In my book, Alien Artifacts, I talk about UFO crashes, reports of UFO crashes going back to the 19th century again. In fact, in Volume 2, which I'm going to bring out in a few weeks, it contains 15 cases of UFO crashes with alien bodies and so on from the 1880s onwards. So in a sense, the Roswell narrative fits very, very well in this pattern of reporting about UFOs that have sort of fallen to Earth in distress and caused the death of their alien occupants. So I have to look at it as a historian and say, wow, how well it fits into the evolution of ufology.
Did Kenneth Arnold ever have a second sighting?
Yeah, in fact, he had several sightings. What I do in this new book, in Sources, is that I think it's the first time anyone's ever put a catalog of all of his sightings together. We don't know whether he had 8, 9, 10, or 11 sightings, but I spoke to his daughter, Kim Arnold, too, and she gave me some information about others that he'd had. But yeah, what I do there is to create the first chronology of his reports of pyramid-shaped objects and strange lights seen during the 1950s, 1960s. I mean, sometimes he thought that he was like the center of attention for UFOs. Maybe they were trying to communicate with him in some way. He also reached the conclusion that they might be living beings similar to jellyfish, but living in the upper atmosphere. So, I mean, he seems to have had a knack for encountering these phenomena repeatedly throughout his life.
You key in a lot on Kenneth Arnold and his stories. Why did you pick him?
Well, as the original UFO witness, I think that if we want to know how the whole UFO subject started, we need to get back to the roots of it all. We need to find out who the first witness was. And the wonderful thing in the case of Kenneth Arnold is that he seems to have been an extremely sincere and honest man. He was simply reporting what he saw. And because he hadn't been exposed to science fiction, he wasn't interested in comics and pulp fiction, amazing stories, that kind of thing. He couldn't have been influenced by what was coming out in comics and magazines at the time. There were no B movies about alien contact in that period. So I think he would be one of the purest witnesses that was ever interviewed. Although, of course, even his sighting wasn't the first, even in that period, because there was also a sighting in San Diego in October 1946 of what people believed was a spaceship. And I don't even think he heard about that case. So, Kenneth Arnold, an iconic figure in the history of ufology. I'm really happy to have put his story together clearly for the first time.
Good, Chris. How did it become so well known, the story?
Well, when he approached the offices of the East Oregonian the next day, they just gave him 5 minutes of their time, these two journalists, Nolan Skiff and William Beckett, and they made a quick report for that day's newspaper. But later on in the day, after lunch, the offices of the East Oregonian were inundated with calls from across the country. People wanted to know more. What had Kenneth Arnold, this aviator, seen in the sky. And it became so popular that William Beckett ran off to Kenneth Arnold's hotel room in the afternoon and said, please give me more information. So they spent 2 hours together, and that's when it all came out. And then that's when Kenneth Arnold said he'd seen bat-shaped objects in the sky. Unfortunately, when William Beckett made a version of this for the Associated Press, he omitted that detail, and everybody reached the wrong conclusion that Arnold had seen disc-shaped objects. Interesting.
And there's no question that once they started realizing how popular it was, the little article that probably was in the first day expanded into a bigger story, didn't it?
Yeah, that's right. And then it became bigger and bigger. So, in just 2 or 3 weeks, Arnold became a celebrity. He was so inundated with calls and letters from everywhere in the country. He felt that he was going mad. He always said that he never regretted reporting what he'd seen, but he wished he'd handled it slightly differently, because he was a man who found himself at the center of this UFO controversy, and there had never been a UFO controversy before. He was the main witness. But then, of course, as the weeks rolled by and so many people came forward with their own stories, ufologists estimate about 8,000 sightings happened in that period. Of course, people lost interest in Arnold's story, which is a shame, because we're talking about the first witness and probably the best one.
How old was he when he had his first sighting? Do you know?
Yeah, he was 31. So he was actually quite young. Oh, sorry, 32, I believe, actually.
Oh,
yeah. So he was very young when he saw this. He'd actually been a football star. I mean, at college, he was already quite well known, but for completely different reasons.
When he died in 1984, I believe, he was 68 years old. Was that what he was remembered as primarily?
Yeah, of course. Yeah. I'm having spoken to members of his family, I can see the amazing legacy he left behind. They have tattoos about their grandfather on their backs with the actual UFO that he'd seen, the sort of crescent-shaped object. And people remember Kenneth Arnold for this reason. He's almost a kind of spiritual figurehead in the UFO world. Unfortunately, people just don't know his story very well, and that's the whole reason I wrote this book, so people can find out what he really said about the sighting.
Do you know UFO writer James Easton?
Yeah, I've heard his name. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
He's written a story about Arnold, too, and I'm not that familiar with it. I'm wondering if you are.
No, I didn't get into too many other books about Kenneth Arnold while I was researching this, mainly because I wanted to go straight to the sources myself. I didn't want to be influenced by other researchers and their conclusions. It's a lot better, if you can, to go straight to the original sources, speak to the surviving family members, and reach your own conclusions. And that's what I do with all of my books, and that's why the feedback I've received has been so good.
If you had a moment to interview Kenneth Arnold when he was alive, what would you have asked him?
I'd have said to him, why did you start changing your story from the 1950s onwards? Because there was a point in which he began to describe the object slightly differently. I think that he was influenced by Ray Palmer, and the UFO topic at the time was evolving so quickly. His own memory of what had happened was fading or slightly twisted. I would say, please sit down and draw exactly what you saw, but draw 9 of them, because there was such a controversy about whether they were all the same shape or just one was crescent shaped. I really wish I had a time machine. I'd spend a whole afternoon with him, just asking him to please go over it again and again and again, and to draw exactly what he saw.
Was he going through a moment of notoriety in those days?
Yeah, I mean, this was something that maddened him and drove his family wild, to be honest, because he was the center of attention for the whole world. At the beginning of the book of Sources, I talk about a bar in Cadiz, which is a small coastal town in Spain, and about how they'd changed the name of the bar from La Botella, or the bottle, to Los Platillos Volantes, flying saucers. So his impact, I mean, the impact of what he saw was so massive that it spread all across the world. So in just a few years, bars and pubs and restaurants were opening in every country with the name Flying Saucers. Because, and the only way that could possibly happen would be if he had achieved, celebrity status. And we're talking about a time when only film stars, movie stars reach that level. But I would say that the impact that Arnold had on culture will outlive whatever Cary Grant did and whatever Brad Pitt's bound to do in the future, because the whole world was enthralled by Kenneth Arnold and his story.
Chris, we're going to take a short break and come back at the top of the hour and take phone calls with you as we talk about your book, Saucers, Tracing the Origins of Disshaped UFOs.